The day Soren Haig paid $35 for a woman's debt. He didn't think of it as buying anything. He thought of it as stopping something. The auction wasn't the kind they advertised in newspapers. It happened in the back lot behind Callister's dry goods store, on a Tuesday in late October, when the first real cold had already pushed down from the mountains and turned the mud in the street hard as iron. There were maybe 12 men standing around, and most of them had the look of people who'd been waiting for something like this for a while. Soren had only come into town for flour and axle grease. He hadn't planned to stay past noon, but he'd heard the noise from the alley, not shouting exactly. More like the sound of men enjoying themselves at someone else's expense. And he'd looked around the corner and seen her. She was standing on a wooden crate in the cold with no coat. Her dress was the kind of grey-brown that starts out some other color and fades to nothing over years of hard use. Her hair had been pulled back, but pieces of it had come loose and were blowing across her face. And she wasn't brushing them away. Her arms were at her sides. Her eyes were fixed on some point, past the crowd, past the buildings, past everything. Visible from that alley. And they had the particular emptiness of someone who has decided not to be present for what's happening to them. A man Soren didn't recognize. Wide-shouldered, wearing a merchant's coat that didn't suit him, was reading from a piece of paper. The woman had debts, he said. Her late husband's debts, which had passed to her by law and which she had failed to discharge. The man holding the paper was the creditor. He was collecting what was owed. $30 was the opening bid. Soren stood at the corner of the building and watched. He told himself it wasn't his business. He had flour to buy and a 3-hour ride back up into the hills. And the pass would freeze solid in another week, and he still hadn't finished chinking the north wall of the storage shed. He had no business standing in an alley in Callister watching something he couldn't fix. 32, said a man near the back. The woman on the crate didn't move. She was still looking at that distant point, but something in the set of her jaw changed, a tightening, almost invisible, the kind of thing most people would miss. Soren noticed it. 35, he said. He wasn't sure why. He had the money. He sold timber and pelts, and occasionally guided survey parties through the high country, and he lived on almost nothing, so there was always something saved. The number wasn't the problem. The problem was that he'd just stepped into something with no clear way out, and he knew it before the word was fully out of his mouth. The merchant looked at him. So did the rest of the men. 35, the merchant repeated. Anyone else? Nobody spoke. The woman on the crate lowered her eyes for the first time. She looked at Soren. He couldn't read her expression. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't relief. It was something more careful than either of those things. A long, measuring look, the kind a person gives when they're trying to decide whether one kind of trouble has just been traded for another. He paid the merchant. He didn't make eye contact with any of the other men. He walked to the crate and stopped a few feet away from her and said, "I have a horse. It's a long ride. You'll need to hold on." She said nothing. She stepped down from the crate and followed him to the street. Her name was Vesta. He learned this 2 hours into the ride, when the town was well behind them, and the trail had started climbing in earnest through the spruce and jack pine, the mountains going up on all sides into low cloud. He hadn't asked. She offered it like she was testing how it sounded, saying it out loud to a stranger. He said his name was Soren. She said nothing back to that. The horse, a bay-quarter horse named nothing in particular, because Soren didn't name his animals, was a steady animal but not built for 2 riders, and by the time they were 2 hours out, Soren could feel Vesta trembling behind him. Not fear, he thought, cold. She'd been standing outside without a coat. For God knows how long, and even with the horse blanket he'd pulled from the saddlebag and passed back to her, the temperature up here in the hills was 10 degrees colder than in town and dropping. He stopped at a creek crossing and got down and helped her down. Her legs nearly went out when she hit the ground. She grabbed the saddle horn and steadied herself, and then straightened up and let go, deliberately, like she didn't want him to see that she'd needed it. He built a small fire. He boiled water and made tea from the tin he kept in his coat pocket, the kind of tea that was mostly bark and dried berries and tasted like medicine, and he handed her the cup without comment. She took it with both hands. "How much further?" she said. "Not a question exactly. Hour, maybe a little more." She nodded and drank the tea. He watched her from across the fire, not staring, just watching in the way you watch weather, trying to read what's coming. She was younger than he'd thought from a distance, late 20s, maybe. Her face had the look of someone who'd been through a winter that wasn't about weather. Sharp around the eyes, a bruise on her left cheekbone that was fading to yellow at the edges, which meant it was a few days old, which meant it had happened before the auction, which meant the merchant or someone connected to him. And Soren stopped, following that line of thought, because it wasn't going anywhere useful. "I'm not going to tell you what to expect," he said. "When we get there." She looked at him over the cup. "I have a cabin. It's not much. There's a loft and a main room. I'll sleep in the loft. You can have the main room." He paused. "That's all I'm going to say about it." Vesta looked at him for a moment longer, then looked back at the fire. "All right," she said. The cabin was, as he'd said, not much. It sat in a hollow about 300 meters off the main trail, surrounded by spruce on 3 sides, and opening onto a clearing to the south where he kept a small kitchen garden in summer. The garden was dead now, just frost-blackened stalks, and the clearing had that particular grey-white look of ground that hasn't quite decided to snow yet. Inside there was a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, a bench along the wall, some shelves, a loft with a rope ladder. The walls were logs, with the gaps chinked with mud and moss, and the floor was split planks, uneven but solid. It was not warm exactly, but it was out of the wind, and the stove had been banked before he left that morning and still had some heat in it. Vesta stood in the doorway and looked at it. "There are blankets in the chest," Soren said, moving past her to the stove. "And food. Help yourself." He built the fire up and left her to it. He slept in the loft that night, listening to her move around below. She was quiet about it, not tiptoeing, just naturally quiet, the way some people are. At some point, she stopped moving, and he assumed she'd slept. He lay on his back on the narrow rope bed and looked at the underside of the roof and thought about what he'd done, and couldn't quite land on whether it had been right, or just impulsive, or both or neither. In the morning she'd made porridge. He came down the ladder and found her at the stove, stirring something in the heavy pot. She'd found the oats and the salt, and a dried apple he'd forgotten was in the back of the shelf. She didn't look up when he came in. "Sit down," she said. "It's ready." He sat down. They ate without talking. Outside, snow had started, fine and dry, the kind that comes early in the season and means business. Soren watched it through the window and did the calculations he always did this time of year. Wood supply, food stores, the condition of the trail, how many weeks before the pass became unreliable. "I can work," Vesta said. He looked at her. "I'm not going to sit here and be kept," she said. Her voice was even, not angry, just clear. "Tell me what needs doing, and I'll do it." Soren thought about this. "Wood needs splitting," he said. "I'll show you where the axe is." She was better at it than he expected. Not fast, but efficient. She found the grain quickly and didn't waste effort fighting it. He watched from the door for a minute, and then went back to his own work without saying anything. Acknowledgement, he'd learned, often felt like condescension to people who needed to prove something to themselves. Better to just let the work speak. The snow settled in over the next few days and didn't leave. The world outside the cabin shrank down to the clearing and the tree line, and the small grey sky visible above it. Soren went out to check his trap lines every morning and came back by midday. Vesta took over the cooking, not by anyone's decision, just by the logic of who was in the cabin when meals needed making. She also patched the gap in the north wall that Soren hadn't gotten to using a mixture of moss and clay she found under the overhang by the woodshed. He noticed the next morning that the draft he'd been ignoring for 2 weeks had stopped. He didn't say anything. He noticed. That was enough. What they didn't do was talk. Not really. They spoke about practical things. Whether the snow was too deep to get to the lower trap line. Whether there was enough salt for the winter. Whether the roof over the woodshed needed bracing before the heavy snow came. These were the kind of conversations that didn't require you to know anything about a person, only what they were looking at with you in that moment. Vesta didn't ask him about himself. He didn't ask about her. There was a particular quality to the silence in the cabin at night. When the stove was banked and the snow was falling outside and the wind ran along the eaves. It was not a comfortable silence, not at first. It had the weight of 2 people being careful. But careful isn't the same as cold. Careful can be its own kind of consideration. It was the 2nd week of November when Soren broke his ankle. He'd gone up the ridge to check a line of snares he'd set near the rock face, and, on the way back, coming down a slope that had looked solid, the crust gave way, and his right leg punched through into a gap between 2 rocks hidden under the snow. And he heard the crack before he felt it. The feeling came a second later. A deep, sickening pain that went all the way up to his hip, and then he was sitting in the snow with his leg at a wrong angle, and the nearest help 300 meters below him in a cabin in a hollow in the woods. He got himself down the slope by not thinking about it. That was the only way. He packed snow around his boot as he went, used a broken branch for support, and kept his mind on the next 10 feet of ground rather than the whole distance. It took an hour and a half. When he came through the tree line into the clearing, Vesta was outside splitting wood, and she looked up, and whatever she saw in his face made her drop the axe and come to him without being asked. She got him inside. She got his boot off, which was the worst part, and which he managed not to make a sound during, though his vision went grey at the edges. She looked at his ankle, already swelling, already going purple, and then she looked at his face with an expression he couldn't read. "I've done this before," she said. "Setting a leg." "Ankle," he said. "Same idea." She stood up. "I need straight wood and cloth and something for the pain. Tell me where." He told her where. She moved fast, without fuss, without the kind of anxious hovering that would have been worse than the pain. She splinted the ankle with 2 pieces of kindling and strips torn from an old shirt, and the work she did was clean and firm, and Soren knew, from the moment she finished, that it had been done correctly. She gave him the last of the rye whiskey he kept on the high shelf for genuine emergencies, and told him to drink it. He drank it. "You can't go out on this," she said. "I know, not for weeks. I know." She looked at him. He looked back. Between them was the unspoken arithmetic of the situation. The trap lines would go unchecked, which meant meat would spoil in the snares, or be stolen by other animals, which meant the food stores would have to carry them further, which meant rationing, which meant a harder winter than planned. Soren had planned a hard winter. This was harder than that. "Tell me where the lines are," Vesta said. "I'll run them." He shook his head. "You don't know the terrain. Then tell me, Vesta Soren." She said his name the way she might have said "listen," flat and clear, and leaving no room for argument. "I have been surviving in bad terrain since I was 12 years old. Tell me where the lines are," he told her. She ran the trap lines every morning for the next 3 weeks. She came back each time with something. Not always much. A rabbit, a ptarmigan, once a marten, and she learned the terrain faster than he would have believed. She started going further, following the ridge line he'd described, and then extending past it, finding places he'd never thought to set snares. She brought back things he hadn't expected. A beaver, one morning. A grouse, another. He spent those weeks at the cabin. He was not good at it. Sitting still was not a thing he'd ever been trained to do, and the enforced rest had a quality of punishment to it, even though no one was punishing him. He sharpened every blade in the cabin. twice. He repaired the snowshoes. He worked through a small back clock of reading he'd been ignoring. A surveying manual, a year-old newspaper from Banff, a battered copy of a Victorian novel someone had left in the supply store, and which he'd taken because no one else had. Vesta read in the evenings too. She'd found the novel after he set it down, and she read it without asking, which he thought was right. Books didn't need permission. One night, the fire low, snow steady outside, she looked up from the book and said, his wife was in on it the whole time. Chapter 4. If you read it again. He thought about it. The letter she sends, he said. The letter. And the way she describes the road to town. She knows the distance exactly. She's been. I thought she was just precise. Women aren't precise without reason, Vesta said, and went back to reading. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, your husband. She didn't look up. The debts. He borrowed against land we didn't own, she said. Her voice was even. Then he died owing it. The law said it transferred to me. A pause. The law says a lot of things. How long ago? 8 months. Another pause. He wasn't a bad man. He just believed the wrong people. Soren said nothing. The merchant, she said, was one of the wrong people. He helped engineer the loan. He knew there was no land. He was waiting for the default. She turned a page. I understood that by the time I was standing on the crate. I didn't understand it when it might have mattered. He looked at her. The firelight was doing what firelight does to a face, softening some things and sharpening others, and she looked tired in the way that isn't about sleep, but about carrying something heavy for too long. You didn't have anyone, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I had myself, she said. That was what I had. He didn't say anything else. He banked the fire and climbed to the loft, and he lay on the rope bed and looked at the roof again, and this time the thinking he did was different from the first night. Less about whether he'd done the right thing and more about something he couldn't quite name, that lived somewhere in the space between two people, with each other in a small cabin, in the snow. His ankle healed slowly. By December he could put weight on it, and by Christmas, which they didn't observe exactly, but acknowledged with a bottle of preserves, Vesta had found in the root cellar, and declared too good for ordinary Tuesday. He could walk without the branch. By the new year he was back on the trap line, and Vesta walked it with him the first few times, showing him the places she'd found, the routes she'd developed, the small adjustments she'd made to his system, that he had to admit were improvements. He admitted it out loud, which surprised him. He wasn't used to saying those things. She looked at him when he said it. A brief look, then back to the trail. But her chin lifted slightly, the way someone's does when something they've earned has actually been acknowledged. February was the hardest. February in the mountains. Always is. The cold that comes in the second month is different from the cold that comes in the first, because by February you've used up whatever novelty was keeping you going, and what's left is just endurance. The days were short, and the nights were long, and the world outside the cabin window was in the same 4 colors it had been, for weeks. White and grey, and the dark green-black of spruce, and the pale gold of the light on snow when the sun came through. They talked more in February, not about important things, mostly. About the animals they'd seen, about whether the spring would come early or late, about the book. They'd both reread it by then, and had positions on every character. But sometimes the conversation would shift and land somewhere real before either of them seemed to have intended it. One night she told him about the first winter she'd spent away from her family at 17, taking a position as a housekeeper in a town 3 days from where she'd grown up. The woman she'd worked for had been demanding and cold, and had a habit of moving the furniture just enough to make Vesta's routine wrong, as a way of reminding her where she stood. Vesta had lasted 2 years. She'd learned to put everything back without being asked, and to make the adjustment before the woman could point it out, and after 2 years she'd understood that she wasn't going to learn anything else there, and she left. "Where did you go?" Soren said. West, she said, then further west. Then I met my husband, and we went north. A pause. I thought north meant away from things. It mostly just meant cold. He understood that. He'd come north himself, years ago, for reasons that had seemed clear at the time, and which he now thought of more as a general direction than a specific plan. Away from things. Cold. The kind of quiet that you either make peace with or it makes you strange. Are you at peace with it? She said. He'd said that last part out loud, apparently. Mostly. He said. Mostly, she repeated, like she was deciding whether that was enough. It was March when things shifted, though Soren couldn't have said what shifted exactly, or when the exact moment was. The days were getting longer. Still cold, but with a different quality of light, the kind that promises something, and the cabin felt different with more light in it, less like a place to wait out something, and more like a place. He came in one afternoon and found Vesta mending the spare snowshoes, sitting in the good chair by the window where the light came in, her head bent over the work. She had found a piece of rawhide somewhere. He didn't know where, and she was doing the repair the correct way, the way his father had shown him years ago, the way he'd almost forgotten. She didn't know it was his father's way. She'd figured it out on her own. He stood at the door with his coat half off and watched for a moment. She looked up, caught him, looking. Didn't look away. He hung up his coat. They didn't say anything about it. There was, by that point, a whole architecture of things they hadn't said, and it had its own kind of strength, like a wall built without mortar, that holds together by the weight of its own stones. What they said instead, that evening, was about the spring. The trail would be open again soon, Soren said. Maybe 3 weeks, maybe 4. The town would be reachable. She could go if she wanted to, or she could go further. He could write a letter. He knew a family in Calgary who needed a housekeeper and would be fair employers, or he knew a woman in Banff who ran a boarding house and sometimes needed help in the summers. He laid out the options the way you lay out a map, without indicating which direction he thought she should take. Vesta listened to all of it. She looked at her hands. She looked out the window at the last light on the snow. "You've been thinking about this," she said. "For a while," he said. "Because the trail's opening. Because you should have a choice," he said. "You didn't have one in October." The fire ticked. Outside, a branch somewhere gave under its snow load and fell. Vesta was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Soren thought she might not answer, that she might just fold the question away somewhere and leave it, which would have been answer enough. But then she reached into the pocket of her apron and put something on the table between them. A brooch, small, silver, set with a piece of pale green stone. Labradorite, he thought. His mother had called it the Northern Stone. He hadn't seen this brooch since the morning he'd left for town in October. He'd assumed he'd left it in the saddlebag. He almost never thought about it. "I found it the first night," Vesta said. "In the chest, at the bottom, under the blankets." He looked at it. "I kept it because I wanted to have something that wasn't debt," she said. "Something that was just mine, something I chose to hold on to." She was looking at the brooch. "I was going to leave in November," she said. "Before the heavy snow. I had a path in my head. I knew I could make it to the nearest farmstead before dark." He said nothing. "But the snow came early," she said. "And then you broke your ankle." A pause. "And then it was winter. And now it's spring," he said. "And now it's spring." She picked up the brooch. She turned it over once in her fingers, that same turning over motion he'd seen her do with problems she was working through, a physical habit of thought. Then she set it back on the table and pushed it toward him, gently, deliberately. "Soren," she said. He looked up from the brooch. Her eyes were steady, not performing anything, not reaching for anything, just there, and present, and clear. "When the trail opens," she said. "Do you want me to stay?" The fire moved. Light shifted across the table, across the brooch, across her face and his hands, and the knots in the old plank floor. He had spent the better part of his adult life not saying things. It wasn't dishonesty. It was more that he'd never trusted words to carry the weight he needed them to. So he'd stopped trying and let silence hold what language couldn't. He'd gotten good at it. Good enough that it had become a habit, and like most habits, it had its uses and its costs. He looked at the brooch on the table. He thought about October. The alley, the crate, the word he'd said before he'd decided to say it. 35. He still didn't know exactly why. Some things, he thought, don't start with a reason. They start with a recognition. Something seen across a cold lot in a mining town. Some arrangement of a person's jaw against a thing being done to them, and your body speaks before your mind has caught up. He thought about November, December, February, March, the ankle, the trap lines, the book, the snowshoe repair, the particular silence of this cabin at night when two people are being careful with each other, which had slowly changed into something that was not about caution anymore. He pushed the brooch back toward her. "Keep it," he said. She looked at him. "It's not mine," he said. "My mother left it. She left a lot of things she didn't need anymore when she left. I kept it because—" He stopped. "I don't know why I kept it, but I know it's not doing anything sitting in a chest." Vesta looked at the brooch for a moment. Then she picked it up and held it, and some of the careful in her face went somewhere else, and what replaced it was something quieter and more real. "That's not an answer," she said. "No," he said. She waited. "Yes," he said. "I want you to stay." Outside, the light was doing what it does in March in the Mountains, going down gold, going down slow, the shadows long and lavender on the snow. The creek somewhere below the clearing was running again, the sound of it just audible through the cabin walls, that first tentative running water after months of silence. Vesta set the brooch on the table, not pushing it back, just setting it down between them, in the space where things that didn't need to be held anymore could rest. "Then I'll stay," she said.